It's Tuesday, it's 9:15 and we're live in Westminster. Because of Wimbledon coverage, we're with you a few hours earlier than normal, and we've persuaded our guests to make the early start too. With me today, Conservative MP Ben Bradley, Labour MP Ben Bradshaw, The Spectator's Isabel Hartman, and from the Financial Times, Jasmine Cameron-Chileshi. The new Health Secretary says our path to freedom will be irreversible, and we need to learn to live with COVID.
In truth, no date we choose comes with zero risk for COVID.
But is the rise in cases a cause for concern?
I remember it will all be over by Christmas. I remember we'll send it packing in 12 weeks.
A new video emerges of Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty being harassed in the park.
Whoever they are, however well known they are as a face, they should be able to walk through our parks and streets unaccosted by yobbos in this way. And
apparently there's a football match on today.
This is it! Come on in! Come on, England!
But is flag waving just for football? Let's start with this story on the front page of The Times. Pupils face total ban on mobile phone use. This is Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, calling for that ban of phones from schools in England. Some schools already do this to a certain extent, but do you agree with the Education Secretary? Ben?
Well, I think, as you say, some schools do have a choice. For the most part, academies can set a lot of their own policies on these issues. I think it's worth looking at. Ultimately, you want to have the best environment for learning and for catch-up. I'd be interested, it's a consultation rather than a decision at this stage, I'd be interested in the feedback from teachers in particular as to whether they think that will help with classroom management and things like that. But it's worth a conversation.
Well, I hope it's a consultation, because the impression given he's already made up his mind, and it seems to me to be a distraction from the immediate crisis, which is the COVID situation in schools and the need to end the ridiculous system we have at the moment that was designed for a pre-vaccine age, and also a distraction from his failure to come up with a proper plan for catch-up. And, you know, the government's own advisor resigned over that issue. So, I mean, let's look at the evidence, let's listen to teachers and parents and schools. But it's a classic distraction, media distraction story, in my view.
Do you agree with that, Isabel? Is this a distraction from more important issues? That's certainly what the article says about teachers' reaction to it. And would it work?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really consistent with the Conservatives' stance on education generally, which is that they should trust schools to make decisions rather than issuing endless diktats from Whitehall. The thing about diktats from Whitehall is that they do tend to be quite attention-grabbing and good, perhaps, as some of the teaching unions have said, distracting from more pressing issues, not just on the immediate COVID crisis in terms of testing and children being off, you know, repeatedly for 10 days after someone in their bubble has tested positive, and all having to go home and go back to the sort of patchy online learning that so many of them are growing frustrated with, but also the catch-up problem that the government hasn't, according to their own catch-up czar who resigned, properly dealt with. So I think as little sympathy as I often have for the teaching unions, who don't represent their members particularly well at times with some of the ways in which they campaign, I think they're probably right that this is a distraction, given the Secretary of State doesn't normally want to be this controlling and micromanaging of schools.
Right, but Jasmine, do you think schools should be mobile-free zones?
And I think a lot of schools already have policies in place in regards to mobile phone usage. I don't think there's a free-for-all going on in schools across the country. I think there are already pretty good limits in place to make sure students are in a good learning environment and aren't distracted. I think it will be interesting to see what teachers say and how this can actually be imposed on a practical basis. And I really understand the logic behind the proposals, but I agree, I do think it's a distraction. I think there are other priorities at the moment, especially after a year of disruption caused by the pandemic.
But just briefly to the politicians, if there was a choice, yes or no, would you make schools mobile free, Ben?
I wouldn't ban it from the centre. I'd leave it up to head teachers to make that decision.
Yeah, I probably agree, to be honest. I think it's horses for courses from that perspective.
All right, well, let's just show everybody this in the Daily Mail. Bring it on. Javid fights for freedom. This is, of course, the new Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. He made his debut appearance yesterday in the Commons, talking about restrictions ending on the 19th of July. Let's just have a listen to a bit more of him. I think we've still got Sajid Javid.
Whilst we decided not to bring forward Step 4, we see no reason to go beyond the 19th of July. Because, in truth, no date we choose comes with zero risk for COVID.
Isabel, Sajid Javid clearly trying to strike a different tone to Matt Hancock, his predecessor. But is there any material difference, do you think, in terms of government policy now he's been appointed?
Well, government policy has always been quite confused over this, and one of the problems over the past year is that ministers have sort of seesawed between being wildly optimistic and then being shown another sheet of data on the latest number of cases and suddenly sounding very cautious indeed. I think it's fair to say that Javid is much more of a sceptic about ongoing restrictions than his predecessor. He also has the benefit of not being exhausted, which everyone else in government is, because he hasn't been in government. And he is also more popular with his colleagues at the moment as well. This may actually end up being a bit of a disadvantage for him, because I think a lot of them will expect him to listen to them in a way that Matt Hancock had stopped doing, and he may find that he spends a lot of time in meetings with Conservative MPs who are trying to persuade him to shift further than even he's comfortable with. But he was obviously clearly trying to set a very different tone in his statement yesterday.
Right. I mean, people are talking now a bit more, including Sajid Javid, about living with COVID. What does that actually mean in practice, Ben Bradley?
Well, we need to move beyond the 19th. I think, as Saj said, there's every reason to believe that we can lift restrictions at that point, subject to what happens over the next few weeks, of course. But I think we touched on schools before, things like children and whole classes isolating in bubbles when actually nobody's got symptoms. Things like that can't carry on, and that's a prime example of where we need to get back to a level of normality. I know we're piloting different versions of managing that around testing and other things, but it's those kind of programmes and those kind of disruptions to people's everyday lives that we just need to get rid of and move on. And it seems, certainly from the first 5 minutes of conversation with Saj, that he sees it that way.
Right. I mean, do we need to quantify it, though, Ben Bradshaw?
Yes, we do. We need to start to have an honest debate, which we haven't even begun, about what the acceptable level of hospitalisations and deaths is going to be. We always knew that the rates would go up when restrictions were lifted. We've always been told that vaccines were the way out of this. We now have a good record on vaccines, other countries too. We have a very high level of immunity within the population because of infections as well. Things aren't going to get much better than this. So if we don't unlock now and learn to live with COVID, we're never going to do that. And we need to start having that honest debate, because the public needs to be prepared for that transition from being sort of all scared in our homes and worried about this to thinking this is how we live with it. And yes, there will be hospitalisations, as there are with seasonal flu, there will be deaths, but we can't strangle the economy for forever. It's just not doable.
I mean, is there acceptable number of deaths?
It's an incredibly difficult question for government to answer, isn't it, from that perspective? And,
well, what do you, I mean, in your mind?
I wouldn't expect them to put a number on it, but I do think we need to be clear, as the PM has, I think, that when you lift restrictions, hospitalisations will rise, deaths will rise. That's inevitable. But that doesn't mean that we can be locked down forever, and we need to get on with it, to be honest.
Jasmine?
I mean, I think we are going to be, moving from a transition, well, as Ben was saying, where we're in lockdown mode, we're anxious, to actually getting used to the fact that some freedoms are going to be relaxed. I don't think there is either political or scientific consensus on the number of deaths or cases that will be acceptable. And I don't actually think we're going to be returning to normal pre-pandemic times. I think even if restrictions will be lifted in law, I think we're still going to see changes in public behaviour. Say, for example, people might want to still wear face masks on the tube, or if you're ill, you won't soldier on and go to work, you'll work from home. So I think it will be the new normal. I don't think we're going back to pre-COVID life.
Right. I mean, you're nodding away there, Isabel. Is there a way of us using metrics or calibrating this in some way? As Ben Bradshaw was saying, we need to have a conversation about it.
Yes, I suppose so. But I think it's also worth noting that in the autumn, government scientists are expecting there to be another surge of COVID, but also a surge in flu cases and a possible threat of pneumonia cases as well, partly because the population's immune systems haven't had the normal load that they do outside of a pandemic. And so we're talking about potentially not publishing the numbers now, but you could see the pressure going back on in the autumn and winter when the NHS starts to be under greater pressure again. And I think that'll be a real conflict point for Conservative MPs who are going to say, well, is our entire policy going to revolve around protecting the NHS? How, to what extent do we have to curtail people's freedom beyond the changes in personal behaviour that Jasmine just mentioned? I think we have shifted in our approach to infection control, to personal hygiene. For instance, I think a lot of people will want to keep using hand sanitizer, but in terms of restricting people's freedoms or telling them to go back home or sending pupils home again, that's going to be very, very difficult to make the case for in the autumn.
Right. I mean, are you in that sort of position, that dilemma, Ben Bradley? As Isabel said, it's all been about protecting the NHS, making sure it doesn't topple over. Does that need to change now we have vaccinations? Well,
I think the vaccination changes the game, right? We're in a position, and we've seen, part of the logic of extending was that we get 10 million more people vaccinated, and that gives us a bit more of an insurance policy against what happens going forward. I do think we need to get back to a more normal, non-pandemic conversation about viruses and illness. We're seeing at the minute A&E's kind of overwhelmed by children with kind of normal everyday colds and flus and fevers because all of a sudden it's spiked post-COVID, and that can't be allowed to kind of put pressure on our NHS in the same way. So we do need to get back to a slightly different version of that conversation, I think.
Or is the government getting ahead of itself? Not everyone was happy with Sajid Javid's statement yesterday. Here's the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth.
Now, I want to see an end to restrictions. Our constituents want to see an end to restrictions. But I hope his confidence today about July 19th does not prove somewhat premature or even, dare I say it, hubristic.
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it, Ben Bradley? We've been here before. Is it sensible to be so sure about lifting restrictions on the 19th of July?
As long as the data on hospitalisations and deaths doesn't get significantly worse in the next week or two, I think so, yes. As we've been discussing, I think, there's been quite a lot of consensus, I'm afraid, between us and with your commentators about this. We have to learn to live with COVID. And as long as we have broken the link between COVID and hospitalisations and deaths, which, thanks to the vaccines, we seem to have done, then we cannot continue locking down the economy and restricting people's freedoms in this unprecedented way. And we have to start preparing the public for that new normal.
Right, but it is about the data. I mean, are you absolutely sure the government will lift those legal restrictions? Isabel mentioned the fact that there are other reviews about things like mask wearing and social distancing, perhaps in public spaces. But on those legal restrictions, are you absolutely 100% sure it'll happen?
We've talked about all those different pilots and projects to test things, but, I mean, nobody can be 100% sure, can they? Because we don't know what's
And what would the reaction be from Tory MPs like you if it isn't?
I would be incredibly frustrated, but I think as things stand, it seems like we're in a decent place, and let's just hope that continues.
Right, let's just show you this. We mentioned it in the headlines, a video of England's Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, being accosted yesterday.
Please, sorry. I won't follow me. I'm going to change that.
Well, as that video emerged, Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, tweeted this. I've seen the video of the CMO being harassed. It's appalling and totally unacceptable. The CMO works tirelessly on behalf of the country. We will not tolerate this sort of behaviour towards our public servants. The men behaving in this disgraceful way should be ashamed. Jasmine, what was your reaction when you saw it?
I mean, it's a really shocking video. Here is this figure of Chris Whitty, someone who we've all come to know, and has been a key figure in handling, the government's response to the pandemic and communicating that, just being harassed. And I think the health secretary's response was robust, and I think rightly so, because I think it's important not to set a precedent where people feel comfortable harassing public figures and filming them. And I also think within government there must be wider concerns about how to deal with the very small but quite vocal anti-vax movement, or those who are, have voiced scepticism towards, the vaccines in general, and how you navigate a public health crisis with that in the backdrop.
Isabel, a proportionate response there from Sajid Javid?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a really troubling video, and something I think that a lot of MPs will recognise from their own experience of being harassed when out and about doing their jobs. And there have been security concerns for MPs for a number of years now, particularly since the murder of Joe Cox. And you can see the fear in Chris Whitty's eyes, because he doesn't know what's going to happen next. He does deal with it incredibly calmly and coolly, as he always does. But I think this does raise questions again about the way in which we treat our public figures, the way in which people who feel it's acceptable to harass them are able to sort of plan these things, are able to congregate, to form sort of little bubbles online where these things become much more acceptable within their social groups. And it's, the message from Sajid Javid was very strong, but it probably won't cut through to the sort of people who would be considering doing this to other public figures.
I mean, there is the issue, Ben Bradley, of more protection for high-profile advisors like Chris Whitty. He has been accosted before. Actually, it was a more hostile harassment in the past by protesters. Do you think this was more over-exuberance?
Yeah, I don't think that's a pre-planned kind of attack in that way, is it? I think it's drunkenness, to be honest, by the looks of it, which doesn't make it any more acceptable. I mean, even without COVID restrictions, that wouldn't be an acceptable way to treat anybody, would it? Never mind somebody trying to go about helping us all, as Chris is. So Sajid was absolutely right to be robust about it.
Ben?
Yeah, I mean, it did look a bit more like sort of drunken boisterousness to me, but it would have been very scary if you were Chris Whitty.
Right.
And we've seen other examples, haven't we, Nick? What, the BBC journalist being manhandled down the street, and we've had the awful attacks during the by-election in Batley and Spen. It does seem that we have a problem with this kind of behaviour in this country, and it does need to be clamped down on very, very hard indeed.
Right, well, you're on the Transport Select Committee. I want to talk to you a little bit about the issue of foreign travel. Well, everybody, in fact, but I'm going to start with you, Ben Bradshaw. This is the headline in The Guardian. UK and Brussels near deal on COVID passports to boost holiday hopes. Now, the Labour Party has been very critical of the government, particularly about borders, saying they should have shut them earlier to prevent, they claim, the Delta variant coming to our shores. The traffic light system has been brought into place to try and monitor travel in and out of the country. Are you a fan?
No. I mean, I think we need a system, and we clearly need a very strict red list system, and you're right. And one of the reasons we have the Delta variant now is because Boris Johnson didn't put India on the red list when he should have done. We need a bigger green list system, in my view. It's ridiculous that a country like Germany, with less than 1/20th of the COVID rates than us, Italy with less than 1/10th, is on the orange list. You still have to quarantine if you're coming in from there, where you're far less of a risk than the average person walking around this country. And our travel industry and tens of thousands of jobs are at risk this summer if we don't get people travelling again safely. And it's perfectly safe to go to most of these countries. I want to see a bigger green list. The amber list is really problematic because of the expense involved and the quarantine involved. But you need to have some warning system so that both individuals and the industry can plan ahead. What's been so frustrating for them is the constant chopping and changing of the system, with people getting stranded or having to rush back very quickly and at great expense because one's moving from one colour to another.
So scrap the amber list then, Ben?
Well, I think as we go forward, we were talking about vaccines before and what that means in terms of getting back to normal. It strikes me that the conversation is about, what are the implications of having two vaccines? Do you still need to isolate if you've had both vaccines? That seems to be the direction of travel both here and in Europe. So I would imagine as we get beyond July into the summer, that might well be the case, and your amber list is defunct then, really, anyway.
Right. Do you think the government's had a successful travel policy?
It's not easy, is it? I don't think everything's
nothing's
been perfect.
easy, I suppose, in that sense.
In hindsight, you can probably pick out things as we all can, but I'm not convinced anyone would have done it any different or any better.
We are less free than other Europeans at the moment, less free than Americans, even though we have the highest vaccination rates. And we're less free than we were last summer. I mean, the vaccines, again, we go back to the same old subject, were supposed to be the things that allowed us to live with this virus. Other Europeans can now travel with a vaccine, with a negative test, or with proof of infection.
But many of them don't want UK travellers, as we're discovering, because Angela Merkel would like to have some sort of UK agreement.
Some don't, but the med countries are ignoring that, aren't they? Because they're desperate to have British tourists back this summer. So, I mean, it is possible. The problem is not outward bound. In the main, the problem is the system coming back from countries that are perfectly safe, like Germany, like Italy, like lots of the Greek islands, where you're still having to quarantine in this country.
Right, but Portugal and Spain and Malta, I understand, are bringing in new restrictions. You will have to be double vaccinated, or at least show a negative PCR test if you're travelling from the UK to get in without quarantine.
that's still less restrictive than the rules for people coming back. As the problem, as I say, Joe, is not outward bound at the moment, although that could deteriorate, we don't know. The problem is all of the restrictions, the quarantine and the cost of testing for people coming back from amber list countries.
We all want to open up, right? We all want to go on holiday. I want to go on holiday, and we need to. But as we've discussed already, the biggest risk in terms of those dates in July or restrictions in the future is new variants. And the biggest risk to that is people moving around the world, different countries. We need to be careful because that's the biggest thing, the biggest potential risk that means that our lifting restrictions is not in the end irreversible. So it's right that we're cautious around it. But there's every political and economic incentive to get people away on summer holidays.
We can't stay locked down because of fear of a yet unknown new variant. I mean, that's a recipe for never unlocking at all, because there might be a new variant out there. There are no new variants in the countries we're talking about.
Right. What about Angela Merkel wanting an EU-wide agreement or ban on UK tourist travelling to the European Union? Do you agree with her?
Well, to me, the biggest restriction on going abroad in Europe is I wouldn't want to quarantine for 10 days when I get there, which is the case at the minute.
So come back.
So we can have that conversation. We obviously talk with those partners and they talk with us. I think, as we've talked about, that double vaccine conversation about lifting quarantine requirements is probably the answer. And I would expect that to kind of be discussed around the 19th of July.
All right, let me just show everybody this headline in the Times. Nissan plans Sunderland Gigafactory. Later this week, the company is set to announce a major expansion of battery production in Sunderland. They may also announce the launch of a new electric car model. Jasmine, can you talk us through this announcement that's expected?
Yeah, so essentially, this is Nissan that's basically committed, or is expected to commit to creating a gigafactory in Sunderland with the idea that it can make batteries for electric cars. And I think the plant could make batteries for as many as 200,000 cars a year. And obviously, this is a huge investment in the area that could potentially create thousands of jobs. It's got a lot of economic and symbolic significance as well, given that there are huge concerns post-Brexit as to what that would mean for the car manufacturing industry, particularly in places like Sunderland. But yeah, so it's, the company is signalling that it will continue to invest in the area, and there's government support because obviously the government ahead of COP26 is hoping to push its green agenda, and electric vehicles tie into that.
Wonderful news that you welcome.
Great news. Yeah, of course it's good news for Nissan and for Sunderland and for the whole region. And, it's welcome the fact that one of the things that was in Boris Johnson's otherwise pretty awful Brexit deal was a solution for manufacturing. But there wasn't a solution for lots of other sectors. And, there have been lots of other reports and examples of jobs being lost, companies closing down, companies moving, and small businesses not being able to export and import anymore.
Right. I mean, the idea of Project Fear, though, one might have expected that these announcements wouldn't actually happen. Nissan had warned that if the UK left the EU without a trade deal, the Sunderland plant would become unsustainable as a result of the tariffs this would entail. But they say the deal the government reached is positive for them. Has Brexit been better than you thought?
No, and I don't think all of its implications and impacts have been felt yet, because we've been living in the last 16 months in a world dominated by COVID, and I think lots of those impacts have been concealed by that. I mean, not just the Northern Ireland Protocol and the mess that's caused, but the impact on thousands and thousands of small businesses, constituents who come to me who say we've just given up trying to import or export stuff between us and the European Union because of the costs, the hassle, the VAT, and everything else. And I think we're seeing already a shift, aren't we? A big reduction in trade between us and the European Union, and a huge fall in our exports to the European Union.
Do you agree with that?
Well, we're seeing big rises in our exports to other places. I think we always knew that things were going to change, our economy was going to change, and COVID has made a mess of trying to figure all that out in terms of analysis, of course. But this is really great news and supports a huge number of jobs and an economy in Sunderland. The kind of gigafactory conversation, electric vehicles and making batteries over here is a big boost for our green agenda. So it's not all perfect and COVID has made it very difficult to judge, but there's certainly some real confidence in our economic recovery post-Brexit and post-coronavirus.
Right, but I mean, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders said in April that 91% of firms were spending more time and resource managing UK-EU trade than in 2020. That's not that positive, is it?
These things take time, right? And it's not something you just flick a switch overnight and everybody gets used to a new system. Government's put lots of advice in place. It's got advisors to support businesses. And as I say, we're signing trade deals in other places. We're opening up new markets as well. So it's not all about the EU, but over time, these things will level out, I'm sure. Well,
but Ben Bradley sounding very relaxed about it. Isabel, do you share that?
I think, as Ben says, it's difficult to measure it because of COVID to a certain extent. I think there has been a lot of reporting that when there's good news, it's sort of despite Brexit, and when it's bad news, it's because of Brexit. So I think this will be a boost for ministers who are hoping to show that because Brexit, good things are happening in the economy as well. But just on a slightly different note about this gigafactory, I actually drive a Nissan Leaf, one of their electric vehicles, and it's all very well the government welcoming this gigafactory announcement, but what they really, really need to do to make normal people, rather than slightly foolish people like me, make the switch to electric, is to sort the charging network out. Because as much as I love driving my Nissan Leaf, I've spent far too much time in it with the battery flat after visiting multiple out-of-order charging points. So the charging network is utterly appalling in this country, and so there needs to be a great deal more effort from ministers to sort that out before anyone with a normal sense of perspective on life wants to move over to electric.
Right, well, Ben, do you accept that?
At the minute, it's the choice, I think, for people who tend to drive very locally around their home and charge at home, isn't it, more so than long-distance journeys? But it's a big part of government's priority, lots of money going into it, and lots of people using their town deals and some of those levelling up funds to put that kind of infrastructure in locally as well.
Jasmine, is it too early to be able to tell the impact of Brexit and separate it from COVID when it comes to stories and announcements like this?
Yeah, I think slightly, because I think had it not been for the pandemic and, the third national lockdown and the surge of cases in the UK, at the beginning of this year, the biggest story would have been the Brexit deal and its ramifications for individuals, on regions, on livelihoods. But really, at the beginning of this year, businesses weren't functioning as normal. None of us were. We were all in lockdown. And I think, as businesses are starting to open up and as things are slowly returning to normal, I think we'll get a better idea of the impact of Brexit on particular businesses. And I don't think it will be a case of it will be overall positive or overall negative. I think there will be some winners and some losers. And I think we're all seeing that, we're told that there would be, we get Brexit done, there'll be an oven-ready deal, but it's proven to be really complicated and having vast ramifications that, span across lots of industries. So I think we're going to spend the next couple of years really getting to grips with the Brexit deal and reconfiguring our relationship with the EU.
Right, well, another Brexit-related story is around the fact that EU nationals living in the UK have until tomorrow to apply for settled status, though the Home Office will allow people indefinite time to complete an application if they have a reasonable excuse for delay. Ben Bradley, Labour are calling for the deadline to be extended until September. Should it be?
I don't think so. I think that everybody who hasn't yet applied, as I understand, is going to get direct communication from government. They're going to get a letter that explains the situation, that they've got 28 days to apply. But we've been talking about this for months. It's not just come up at the last minute. We've been working with media, with employers, with landlords and all sorts of different groups to try and get this message across. So I'd encourage anybody who's still waiting to get on with it and do it. But everybody's going to get that direct additional contact to make sure we get as many people as we can over the line.
Ben Bradshaw, have they had enough time?
No, and I think partly, again, because of COVID. The system's been working very slowly. Thousands of people have had a lot of problems dealing with it. There's a particular problem around cared-for children and children leaving care. And I worry that if we don't grant an extension, we'll be exactly where we were with the Windrush scandal, and there'll be thousands and thousands of people in this country who lose their access to benefits, who even face deportation, as we saw with Windrush, when they have every right to be here, and they contribute and have contributed to our country for many years.
Ben Bradley, another Windrush?
I don't think it's in any way comparable to Windrush. I think that's a bit of an odd thing to say, to be honest. But the situation as it stands is, as I say, we've had months of working towards this. We're trying to get everybody over the line. Anybody who's got their application in, even if it's not processed before the deadline, will be included, and will have all those rights to stay and to work in this country. And you know what? As you've said, if there are reasonable excuses as to why you've not done it, there will be flexibility. I think that's about as good a system as we could possibly have.
I mean, is there really a comparison to Windrush, Ben Bradshaw, when it comes to this particular scheme for settled status?
Yes, there could be. I mean, I've had constituents contact me who've had young people coming from the European Union who've been put into a camp and deported. And so we are deporting people who are European Union citizens who haven't gone through the right paperwork. So there's absolutely no. Unless the government's going to operate the system differently from the way it operated the system for the immigrants from former Caribbean countries and other colonies, then there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't be the same as when it doesn't have to be. But if the government wants to get this right, give it a bit more time. Why not give it a bit more time?
Well, Ben?
I don't know specifics of the cases Ben talks about, but there's a big difference between people who we all accept had legitimate right and everything to work here, had all that paperwork, had everything in place that they should have had, and the Windrush scandal was just that, it was a scandal. This is not that. We've had a lot of communication, a lot of time to get used to this, and it's a perfectly legitimate process. People need to apply by the deadline, and then they'll have every right to stay.
Isabel, is there a risk of people falling through the cracks unfairly? Ben Bradshaw mentions people either who are in care or perhaps children who become adults and then try and enter the higher education system, for example.
I think there's a particular issue with those vulnerable groups in that they don't really have a voice in our public debate, and it can be very easy for them to be overlooked when they are being mistreated by the state in one way or another, not just on immigration status, but both Bens on your programme will know this from their constituency surgeries, that they are one of the groups who find it very difficult to get a hearing from officialdom a lot of the time. I expect a sort of wider level that ministers will be very anxious not to have another row that could be compared in any way to Windrush. So I would imagine that the exceptional circumstances would be applied quite widely to those who haven't been able to apply by the deadline, precisely because they don't want to have another political row that sends a message about about the way in which Britain is open or not post-Brexit.
Jasmine?
And I think what the Windrush scandal illustrated is that it's really small administrative errors or misunderstandings of the part of the Home Office can really completely destroy people's lives. And I think the key to ensuring that this doesn't end up being another Windrush is ensuring that the Home Office actually has the resources to help people. So we've heard that, lots of people struggling to get through the helpline, and there are obviously people who are concerned, there are concerns that people, the most vulnerable, might be left behind. So I think it's about making sure the Home Office has the right resources to carry out this, this process in a timely and effective manner, make sure that people feel supported during this process, because it must be incredibly anxiety-inducing and exhausting. If you've made the UK your home, and now you've worked and contributed, and now you're having to prove your status. So I think it's all about how much resources the Home Office choose to dedicate towards this.
And has enough been said by Keir Starmer, Ben Bradshaw? This is the headline in The Observer. The Labour leader Keir Starmer urged to speak out and help millions of EU citizens in Britain. More than 400 Labour activists have written to Keir Starmer saying it's inexcusable for the party to remain so quiet as they see it on the issue. Do you agree? Could he have said more?
No, we haven't remained quiet. We've called for an extension. Nick Thomas-Simmons, who's the Shadow Home Secretary, has called quite clearly and in the strongest possible terms.
But Keir Starmer they're talking about here.
People want Keir Starmer to give a running commentary on every single issue. That is not the job of a leader of the opposition. A leader of the opposition's job
Aren't these the issues he should be fighting on and making himself known? Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, was the one who said we just didn't know, or people didn't know what Keir Starmer stood for and was about.
Well, I don't agree with that either. I mean, Keir Starmer does a great job every week at Prime Minister's Questions, holding this government to account. I don't want a leader of the opposition who jumps on every subject, commenting on every subject. I want a leader of the opposition who's doing a great job at rebuilding the Labour Party after our worst election defeat since 1935. So that's what I want him to focus on. And it's also extremely difficult for an opposition leader in the middle of a national emergency like a pandemic that anything he says is noticed by the public. So I'd rather he kept his powder dry, get through the pandemic. When politics returns to normal, then he can stick the knife in.
All right, you've made that very clear. Now, unless you've been hiding under a rock, you'll know there is a huge, enormous football match this evening, or actually this afternoon for England against Germany in the Euros. Scotland and then Wales were knocked out of the competition, so England is the last home nation left in it, and we'll no doubt see flags being flown in Wembley Stadium tonight. Now, we're just going to reflect on the issue of flags with Professor Robert Coles. He's a Professor of Cultural History at De Montfort University. Welcome to you. He's also written a book about the history of sport in this country and joins us from Leicester. What will you think, Robert, when you see those flags being waved tonight at Wembley?
Well, I'd be interested in seeing what flags they are. I think there's been a really big change in how this nation chooses its flags and what nation we're talking about. I was just looking at YouTube pictures from the 1966 World Cup, and there are very few flags, actually, and the few that there were Union Jacks. That was Union Jacks for England, and there were a very, very few West German flags, which looked like they were in clumps. Now, the Union Jack has gone pretty much as an English signifier, and we're now with the Red Cross of St. George. And the Germans have become much more keen on flag waving. I think there was a certain reserve and a certain shyness in Germany about flag waving so soon after the war in 1966, but not now. I think we'll see a lot of German flags tonight and a lot of English Red Cross St. George flags.
Right. I mean, Robert, you've written that we're less likely to see flags in this country in general than we are in America and some other European countries, particularly when there isn't a football tournament on. What does that say about this country?
Well, I think it's interesting. We're not great flag flyers. This government and the opposition actually have been trying to get us to be more used to the Union Jack. But I think really it goes against the national taste. I think there's a maturity in it, a kind of non-political, political maturity. Flying a flag from your garden is a bit like having an argument with your neighbour, as long as you keep it there. So I think flags are all right here, but as long as they're up and down and over with. They're also very tacky. It doesn't take long for a flag to look really awful, like an old tea towel, if it's out in the wind and the rain.
Right. Well, let me get some reaction from our panellists. Ben Bradley, it's not really our national taste.
I'm not so sure about that. It has kind of takes me back to Emily Thornberry and sneering at England flags outside council houses in an election not so long ago. I think for me, that pride and patriotism is important. I've got my England face mask ready for later on, and brought my England shirt into the office today. I think we are a kind of proud, patriotic nation. I'm a council leader. I've just changed our policy to fly the Union flag outside our offices every day. I think that's important, and that cultural element, that pride in Britishness, Englishness, that we should pass on and teach to our kids.
Professor Coles, your reaction to that?
I think the point is we don't need telling who we are or where we live. And the point about a Union Jack is that it's a bit like talking about British values. We don't need telling what our values are. We either have them or we don't have them. And if we don't have them, we don't need telling what they are. If we do have them, nor do we need telling what they are. I'm not saying I'm against flags. I'm not saying the British or the English are against flags. I'm just saying we're against them on government, on kind of a government image. And not because they look zealous or anything, they just look really dull. So I'm all for the flags tonight. I'll be rooting for England, but I'll be glad when they're pulled back again when we finally win the tournament.
Ben Bradley?
There's a bit of a cultural kind of divide here, isn't there? And it rings true of Brexit and all sorts of other issues. And there's lots of groups and lots of people who like to tell other communities what their values should be, but don't like to hear the same in return. It's an interesting dynamic.
Ben Bradshaw?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with flags. I think the professor's right in that, if you have a mature and a confident sense of your own patriotism, then you don't need to wave a flag to illustrate that. And I think that's probably why the British and the English in particular have kind of been more understated in that. Interesting that the Germans are reconciling themselves to their national symbols. I suspect that's about coming, the younger generation not feeling so responsible for Germany's difficult past and coming to terms with those symbols. So, I don't have a problem with the flag, but I think, gratuitous flag waving by politicians, I think the public see through that.
And what do you think of that? Because we see lots of politicians now, particularly on Zoom, and when they have been doing interviews with flags behind them. Yeah,
it seems to me, I don't have a problem with it if that's what they want to do. And I think I've been known to have a flag of St. George in the background when I've done a TV interview, or heaven forbid, a European Union flag during the referendum, and a Devon flag. But I think the public can see through it when it's sort of over the top and gratuitous. It's like the Americanisation of our political system, which doesn't sit well with the English.
Jasmine, what do you make of Professor Colesby saying people don't need to be told their values or told what to do?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And I think the resurgence of flag imagery outside the context of football has largely come from government. As you mentioned, we've seen ministers appearing on the broadcast round with flags behind them. We're seeing Union Jack face masks. I think even David Frost has been known to carry out negotiations with Union Jack socks. And I think it's part of the fact that now we've left the EU, I think, the country is trying to establish a post-Brexit identity. And so it's only inevitable that the government is trying to use symbolism as well as policy to carve out its own idea of Britishness. I don't think, I don't know if the public really warmed to that. And I don't think we're going to see more flags in people's private homes, for example. I think the government are trying to, obviously ramp up the usage of flags, but I don't think we don't have that culture in the UK. It's not like America where you can go down the street and see lots of flags outside people's homes.
What do you make of all this and the discussion around it, Isabel?
I'm feeling slightly insecure because I'm broadcasting from my shed and I don't have any flags in here at all. So
And
I
any
feel like
socks?
I should do some. I don't have any Union Jack socks on, but I think it's interesting. I think this is quite an English perspective as well, because there's much more unease around the English flag and people flying it in England, as we saw with Emily Thornberry quite a few years ago now, than there is where I live in Scotland, where the Saltire will fly from people's flagpoles. In fact, there's a flagpole that I can see from my house that somebody's got a Saltire flying from. And I have to say there are fewer flags since Scotland's own performance in the football. But I think I agree with Ben here that there's something about politicians flag waving or adorning their bedrooms or indeed their sheds with flags for Zoom that can look a little bit weird, a bit like politicians who don't care about football sort of suddenly becoming very, very keen on talking about it when they, like me, don't really find it that interesting.
Professor Coles, you're laughing away?
Yeah, I think Isabel's spot on here. George Orwell said that the English intellectual classes would rather steal from the poor box than stand for the national anthem. And I think we've got a thing here with the English intellectual class. I'm glad all your panel are cool about flags, but in general, the English intellectual class are not happy about flags. You'd never see them fly one from their car, let alone their garden. So I think the resurgence of the Red Cross of St. George is actually a class signifier. I think it's about working class people saying it's our country too, and we've got the right to do these things. It's true, of course, that there are bad edges to this tradition, but down the middle, it's straightforward. Our patriotism is as good as your patriotism. And of course it is. So I'm in favor of it. I'm really surprised that your panel are cool about it. I don't think they're really cool about it in their everyday life.
Oh, well, let's put that to them. Professor Coles, thank you very much. Are you cool about it, to use the professor's word, in everyday life? Is it very much a working class thing, as he said?
I think he's right. I've an interesting view of what he thinks my background is, perhaps. But I think it is perhaps a class signifier. If you go around Mansfield, you're probably much more likely to see England flags maybe than you would around the more kind of metropolitan areas. But it's absolutely the case that I think people see that as a level of identity that, going back, politicians, Emily Thornberry is the example we keep coming up with, but have sneered at that and have looked down on that. And it is an element of pride, and this is me and this is what I'm about.
Right. Was Emily Thornberry, we remember that time she was accused of sneering at the use of the flag. Was that difficult? Did that show unease, Ben?
I don't know. I can't speak for her, but I don't have. I actually like the flag of St George, and if I were to fly a flag, and indeed I have in the past, I would fly that one rather than the Union flag. And I think Isabel's absolutely right. There's an English issue here where, I think there was a time when the flag of St George was expropriated by, political groups, and I'm really glad that the country as a whole, England as a whole, has reappropriated the flag for all of us. And so I think people should fly the flag with pride if that's what they want to do. I think when politicians adorn their bedrooms and offices and sheds with them, it looks slightly iffy. Well,
I'm going to return to Professor Coles. Said, of course, England are going to go through and win the tournament, he said. But Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has tweeted good luck to England ahead of today's game against Germany. Staff should be allowed to finish early so they can watch the match. Hashtag Euro 2020. Should they be allowed to finish early? Will you let your staff go? I'm all for everybody watching the match. I don't suppose my staff will give me a choice, to be fair. Isabel, will you be watching?
No.
You took a while to say that.
They always lose when I... They always lose when I watch.
Oh,
so.
well, then don't watch. Jasmine?
I'll have it on in the background.
And Ben, I presume you will.
I'm going to be one of those politicians, I'm afraid, who's not going to pretend I'm a big football fan, but I will be watching it. Oh, I wish I'd never asked. Anyway, I'll be back here tomorrow at the usual time of 11:15. From all of us, bye-bye.